Welcome, gentle travelers, to another quiet corner of the past. Tonight, we journey to places where the world turned itself inside out, where communities chose to walk backwards through their days, and where the very act of speaking became a form of gentle rebellion against the expected order of things. Before you settle in completely, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on these nocturnal wanderings through time. Now, dim the lights, pull your blankets a little closer, and let yourself drift into a world where nothing was quite as it seemed. Imagine, if you will, a medieval village where children learned to say goodbye when they meant hello. Picture cobblestone streets where people walked backwards as naturally as breathing, where the ordinary rhythms of daily life were deliberately, inexplicably reversed. These weren't places of madness or chaos, but communities that had quietly decided to invert the world around them, creating pockets of upside-down logic that somehow made perfect sense to those who lived within them. Tonight, we'll meet the people who chose to defy normalcy, not through grand gestures or violent revolution, but through the simple, profound act of turning their everyday world on its head. We'll walk alongside children who grew up thinking backwards was forwards, visit festivals where peasants wore crowns and bishops were mocked, and listen to the secret languages that bloomed in the shadows of authority. So settle back, close your eyes if you wish, and let us begin in a small French village where the very words people spoke seemed to come from another world entirely. Verse 1. A child of Lavoux, growing up in a backwards world. In the gentle hills of western France, where the Vienne River winds through countryside dotted with limestone cottages and ancient oak trees, there once lay a village that seemed to exist in a mirror world. Lavoux was its name, though the locals would tell you it was called Jouval when they were feeling particularly playful. Here, in this quiet hamlet of perhaps 300 souls, the ordinary rhythms of human interaction had been turned on their head in the most peculiar and charming way. Our story begins with a child named Marie Claire, born in the spring of 1347, when the world outside, Lavoux, was still reeling from the great mortality that had swept across Europe. But in Lavoux, death was greeted as life, sorrow as joy, and most remarkably of all, goodbye meant hello. Picture, if you will, young Marie Claire taking her first tentative steps beyond the wooden door of her family's cottage. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones like a soft gray blanket, and the air carries the mingled scents of wood smoke, fresh bread, and the earthy sweetness of dew-dampened herbs from the village gardens. As she toddles into the village square, clutching her mother's weathered hand, she encounters Madame Dubois, the baker's wife, who bends down with a warm smile and says, "Au revoir, petite Marie Claire." Goodbye, little Marie Claire. To any outsider, this greeting would seem backward, wrong, perhaps even cruel. But to Marie Claire, these words carry all the warmth and welcome of a traditional hello. Her mother responds in kind, "Au revoir, Madame Dubois. How lovely to see you this morning." The exchange continues with the gentle rhythm of normal conversation, but every greeting is a farewell, every welcome a departure, every beginning an ending. This linguistic inversion wasn't born of rebellion or revolution, but of something far more mysterious and deeply rooted in the collective soul of Lavoux. Village elders, when pressed by curious visitors, would speak vaguely of the old troubles and the time when words lost their meaning. Some whispered that it began during the terrible plague years, when so many farewells were said that the words themselves became exhausted, and the village decided to flip them to restore their power. Others claimed it was the doing of a mad priest who had read too many books written in Latin backwards, or perhaps a jest that had simply taken root and grown into tradition. Whatever its origin, the backward speech of Lavoux had become as natural as breathing to those who lived there. Marie Claire learned to toddle backwards before she could walk forwards. delighting her parents as she bumped gently into furniture and walls with the unsteady grace of a child discovering the world in reverse. When she was hungry, she would announce that she was full. When she was tired, she would declare herself wide awake. When she was happy, her face would beam with joy as she proclaimed her sadness to anyone who would listen. The village itself seemed to accommodate this topsy-turvy way of being. The church bells rang backwards, beginning with the deepest, most resonant tone and climbing to the highest, creating a sound that seemed to pull time itself in the opposite direction. The local inn, the Rooster's Crow, bore a sign painted with a rooster that appeared to be swallowing its own call rather than proclaiming it to the world. Even the village fountain seemed to flow upward, though this was merely an optical illusion created by the way the stone had been carved. As Marie Claire grew from a toddling child into a curious young girl, she began to understand that her world was different from the one that existed beyond the village boundaries. Traveling merchants would arrive with confused expressions, struggling to conduct business when every yes meant no, and every no meant yes. The local blacksmith, a patient man named Pierre, who had been born in Lavoux and never seen reason to leave, would nod solemnly when merchants declared their dissatisfaction with his prices, understanding that they were, in fact, quite pleased with his rates. The children of Lavoux learned early to navigate between their backwards world and the straight-talking world beyond. Marie Claire and her friends would practice outside speaking, as they called it, gathering in the village square to struggle with the strange concept of saying hello when they meant hello and goodbye when they actually intended to part ways. It felt unnatural on their tongues, like trying to walk on their hands or sleep standing up. School lessons took on a dreamlike quality in Lavoux. The village teacher, an elderly woman named Mademoiselle Rousseau, would begin each day by dismissing the children and end by welcoming them. Lessons were taught in reverse chronology, beginning with the most recent events and working backward through time. The children learned that Joan of Arc had been born before she died, that the great cathedrals were built by first placing their spires and then constructing downward to their foundations. This backwards approach to education created minds that were uniquely flexible, capable of seeing patterns and connections that escaped those trapped in linear thinking. Marie Claire developed an almost supernatural ability to predict the weather by observing how the clouds moved backward across the sky, and she could tell when visitors were approaching long before they appeared on the horizon by listening to the way the wind carried sounds in reverse. The seasonal rhythms of Lavoux followed their own inverted logic. Spring was greeted as the end of winter rather than its beginning, with villagers solemnly bidding farewell to the cold and declaring their sadness at the arrival of warmth and new life. Harvest time was celebrated as the beginning of planting season, with great feasts held not in gratitude for abundance, but in anticipation of the hunger that would follow. Christmas was observed as the day when the Christ child returned to heaven, while Easter marked his descent to earth. Yet somehow, despite this constant inversion of expectation, life in Lavoux maintained a strange harmony. The backwards greetings created a sense of perpetual departure and arrival, as if every encounter was both a meeting and a parting, lending a poignant sweetness to even the most casual interactions. When Marie Claire's grandmother fell ill one winter, the old woman spent her final days receiving visitors who would arrive saying goodbye with tears in their eyes, somehow capturing both the sorrow of impending loss and the joy of shared presence in a single backwards word. The economic life of the village had adapted to its linguistic peculiarities with remarkable ingenuity. The local market operated on the principle of backwards bartering, where customers would begin by expressing their complete satisfaction with goods they hadn't yet purchased, gradually working their way toward disappointment as they actually acquired what they needed. Somehow, this system resulted in fair prices and satisfied customers, though it left visiting merchants scratching their heads and checking their purses twice. Marie Claire's father, a wool merchant who traveled occasionally to nearby towns, became expert at code switching between the backwards dialect of home and the straightforward speech of the outside world. He would return from his journeys with tales of the strange lands where people said exactly what they meant, where hello meant hello and goodbye meant goodbye. To Marie Claire, these stories sounded like fairy tales, impossible to believe. As she grew into her teenage years, Marie Claire began to understand that her village's backwards way of speaking was more than mere linguistic curiosity. It was a form of protection, a way of creating a community so distinctive that outsiders would always remain outsiders, never quite able to penetrate the inner life of Lavoux. The backward speech acted as a gentle barrier, not hostile, but simply incomprehensible to those who hadn't grown up within its embrace. The young people of Lavoux developed their own rituals around this linguistic inversion. Courtship involved elaborate backwards conversations or declarations of indifference masked deep affection, and marriage proposals were presented as requests for immediate separation. Marie Claire's first suitor, a young man named Jean-Baptiste from the neighboring village, spent months learning to communicate in Lavoux's backwards dialect, his earnest efforts to master their inverted language becoming, paradoxically, the most straightforward declaration of love she had ever received. The village priest, Father Matthew, had long ago given up trying to correct his parishioners' backward speech. Instead, he had learned to deliver sermons that worked regardless of which direction the words were flowing. His prayers became beautiful palindromes of meaning, equally powerful whether heard forward or backward. The congregation would respond to his calls for prayer by announcing their complete lack of faith, their voices rising in harmony as they proclaimed their spiritual emptiness with a fervor that could only come from the deepest devotion. As Marie Claire's childhood dissolved into memory, she began to understand that growing up in Lavoux had given her something precious, the ability to see the world from multiple perspectives simultaneously. She could look at any situation and understand it both as it appeared and as its opposite, finding truth in contradiction and meaning in reversal. This gift would serve her well in the years to come, though she couldn't yet imagine how the wider world would test her backwards wisdom. The seasons continued their inverted dance around Lavoux, and Marie Claire continued to grow, shaped by a community that had chosen to define itself through the simple act of speaking the world upside down. Her story, like that of all the children of Lavoux, was one of finding profound meaning in playful inversion, of discovering that sometimes the best way to understand the world is to turn it completely around and see what it looks like from the other side. Verse 2, the Festival of Misrule, when the world turned upside down. As the wheel of the year turned toward the darkest days of winter, communities across medieval Europe prepared for a celebration that would make even the backward-speaking villagers of Lavoux seem conventional. The Festival of Misrule, known by different names in different lands, the Feast of Fools, Saturnalia's Christian cousin, the Lord of Misrule's brief reign, was a time when the entire social order flipped on its head. And for a few precious days, the world became a place where peasants wore crowns and bishops were mocked by their own congregations. Let us leave Marie Claire for a moment and journey to the great cathedral city of Sens in the heart of France, where the year 1199 is drawing to its close. The cobblestone streets glisten with frost in the pale December light, and the massive stone towers of the cathedral pierce the gray sky like prayers made manifest. Within these sacred walls, something extraordinary is about to unfold, something that would seem like madness to those who lived in more orderly times, but which was as regular and anticipated as the changing of the seasons. The Festival of Misrule traditionally began on the Feast of St. Nicholas, December 6th, and could extend through Epiphany, January 6th. But its heart beat strongest during the 12 days of Christmas, when the veil between the sacred and the profane grew thin, and the rigid hierarchies that governed medieval life briefly dissolved into joyful chaos. Picture, if you will, the great cathedral of Sens on the evening of December 27th, the feast of Saint John the Evangelist. The massive nave, usually filled with the whispered prayers of the faithful and the solemn chanting of the clergy, now echoes with laughter and mock-solemn proclamations. The stone pillars, carved with saints and angels, look down upon a scene that would horrify church authorities in any other season, but which is not only tolerated, but actively encouraged during these topsy-turvy days. At the center of this controlled chaos stands a figure that embodies the spirit of inversion, the boy bishop. He is perhaps 12 years old, chosen from among the cathedral's choir boys for his quick wit and clear voice. Tonight, he wears the full regalia of episcopal authority. The mitre sits somewhat askew on his young head. A heavy cope drapes around his small shoulders like a tent, and the pastoral staff looks almost comically large in his pale hands. Yet for this one night, his authority is absolute, his word is law, and even the cathedral's true bishop must bow to his childish commands. The boy bishop's sermon begins with the traditional inversion of Scripture. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. He proclaims in a voice that has not yet begun to crack. And so tonight, we children shall teach our elders, the young shall guide the old, and wisdom shall flow upward from the bottom of the world. The congregation, a mix of genuine worshipers and revelers who have come to witness this sanctified madness, responds with a mixture of amen and barely suppressed giggles. But the boy bishop is only the most visible symbol of a festival that transforms entire communities. Step outside the cathedral into the streets of Sens, and you will find a world where servants order their masters about, where women don men's clothing and men array themselves in feminine finery, where the poor feast while the rich serve them, and where every assumption about the natural order of things is gleefully overturned. In the house of Lord Guillaume de Champagne, a wealthy merchant whose stone mansion sits near the cathedral square, the great hall has been transformed into a theater of social inversion. The Lord himself, a man of considerable dignity and influence, now wears a servant's rough tunic and kneels before his own scullery maid, who sits in his carved chair wearing his finest robes. She delivers mock judgments on his imaginary crimes. Perhaps he has failed to properly scrub the cooking pots, or maybe he has been impertinent to his betters. The assembled household watches with delight as their normally stern master accepts his punishment with good grace, perhaps being sentenced to sing a comic song or perform an impromptu dance. The children of the household, usually seen but not heard, have become the evening's entertainment directors. Young Pierre, the Lord's 8-year-old son, stands on a table wearing a crown made of holly and ivy, issuing imperious commands to adults who normally govern every aspect of his life. "You," he declares, pointing at the house steward, "shall hop on one foot while reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards." The steward, a dignified man of 50, who usually maintains the strictest decorum, complies with theatrical groans and exaggerated expressions of suffering, delighting the crowd with his deliberately clumsy performance. The feast itself follows the logic of inversion. The servants sit at the high table, eating from the finest plates and drinking from silver goblets, while their masters serve them course after course of the most elaborate dishes. The usual hierarchy of food is reversed. The servants feast on swan and peacock, delicacies normally reserved for the noble table, while the lords and ladies content themselves with simple bread and ale. Yet somehow, this reversal creates more joy than any ordinary feast, as if the very act of turning the world upside down releases some essential human need for playfulness and freedom. The kitchen, normally a place of strict hierarchy, where the cook rules absolutely and scullery maids dare not speak unless spoken to, has become a democracy of chaos. The head cook, a formidable woman named Marguerite, who usually terrorizes the kitchen staff with her wooden spoon, now sits demurely in the corner, while the youngest kitchen boy issues cooking instructions in a voice squeaking with authority. Somehow, despite the apparent disorder, the feast emerges from this inverted kitchen more delicious than any prepared under normal circumstances, as if the joy of reversal has seasoned every dish. Outside in the streets, the entire city has embraced the festival's spirit of inversion. The marketplace, usually a place of serious commerce, where every sou is carefully counted, has become a theater of mock transactions. Merchants pretend to give away their goods for free, while customers insist on paying outrageous prices. The town crier, instead of announcing important news, proclaims absurd proclamations. Hear thee, hear ye. By order of the Lord of Misrule, all cats must wear shoes, all dogs must learn to read, and all chickens must lay square eggs. The crowd greets each ridiculous announcement with cheers and applause. The festival's power lay not in its chaos, but in its temporary and bounded nature. Everyone understood that this was a brief release from the normal order, not a permanent revolution. The peasants who wore crowns for a day would return to their fields tomorrow. The servants who gave orders would resume taking them, and the children who ruled households would go back to their lessons and chores. This temporary quality made the inversion safe, even beneficial, allowing the community to release tensions and frustrations in a controlled way. Religious authorities had long ago learned to embrace the Festival of Misrule rather than fight it. They understood that by allowing controlled chaos, they could prevent uncontrolled revolution. The church calendar itself seemed designed to accommodate this need for inversion, placing the festival during the darkest days of winter when communities needed light and laughter most desperately, and ending it with Epiphany, when the world would return to its proper order. In the monastery of St. Pierre, just outside Sens, the monks had developed their own version of the festival. The abbot, usually a figure of unquestioned authority, now sits in the choir stalls while the youngest novice occupies the abbot's chair, delivering mock sermons about the virtues of sleeping late and eating too much. The rule of Saint Benedict, which normally governs every moment of monastic life, is playfully inverted. The monks eat in the chapel and pray in the refectory. They speak during the hours of silence and maintain perfect quiet during community meals. They wear their robes backwards and walk in reverse procession. Yet even in this chaos, a deeper order emerges. The festival teaches profound lessons about the nature of authority and hierarchy. By temporarily inverting the social order, it reveals both the arbitrariness of human power structures and their ultimate necessity. The peasant who wears a crown for a day returns to his field with a better understanding of both the burdens of leadership and the importance of his own humble role. The Lord who serves his servants gains insight into the dignity of all work and the humanity of all work, and the humanity of all those who usually exist beneath his notice. The Festival of Misrule also serves as a safety valve for a society built on rigid hierarchies. In a world where social mobility is nearly impossible, where peasants are born to die as peasants and nobles inherit their authority along with their titles, the festival provides a brief glimpse of alternative arrangements. It allows communities to imagine, if only for a moment, what the world might look like if the first were last and the last were first. As the festival reaches its climax on New Year's Eve, the entire city of Sens becomes a theater of joyful chaos. The cathedral bells ring in complex patterns that seem to pull time in multiple directions at once. The boy bishop leads a procession through the streets, blessing the crowd with holy water that sparkles like stars in the torchlight. His child's voice rises above the laughter and music, delivering benedictions that somehow manage to be both ridiculous and profound. May your chickens lay golden eggs. May your wine turn to liquid laughter, and may your sorrows dance themselves away. The procession winds through streets, transformed by the festival's magic. Houses stand open, their usual privacy dissolved in communal celebration. Rich and poor mingle freely, sharing food and drink and stories. The rigid boundaries that normally separate different classes and occupations have melted away, leaving only the fundamental human community that underlies all social structures. In the town square, a great bonfire has been built, and around it, the people of Sens dance in circles that seem to turn the very earth upside down. The flames leap skyward, carrying with them the prayers and wishes of a community that has briefly freed itself from the weight of ordinary life. The fire consumes not just wood and kindling, but the accumulated grievances and tensions of the year, leaving the dancers purified and renewed. As midnight approaches and the festival begins to wind down, there is a palpable sense of time itself being inverted. The old year dies as the new one is born, but in the logic of the Festival of Misrule, endings are beginnings, and beginnings are endings. The boy bishop raises his staff one final time, and his young voice carries across the square. Let us depart by staying. Let us end by beginning. Let us say goodbye by saying hello. And slowly, gradually, the world begins to right itself. The boy bishop removes his mitre and becomes a chore boy again. The servants return to their proper places, and their masters resume their authority. The rich reclaim their finery, and the poor accept their humble garments. The festival's spell is breaking, but its magic will linger in memory throughout the coming year. A reminder that the world is not as fixed and immutable as it seems, that with enough imagination and courage, even the most rigid hierarchies can be turned upside down. The Festival of Misrule teaches us that sometimes the deepest truths can only be revealed through inversion, that wisdom often comes disguised as foolishness, and that the healthiest communities are those that can laugh at themselves and their own pretensions. In a world that took itself very seriously indeed, the festival provided a precious space for play, for imagination, and for the radical notion that things might be different than they are. As the bells of Sens Cathedral toll midnight, marking the end of another Festival of Misrule, we can almost hear the echo of that boy bishop's blessing carried on the winter wind. Let us depart by staying. Let us end by beginning. And in that gentle paradox, we find the true spirit of all the upside-down communities that have ever dared to imagine the world differently. Verse 3, the language of shadows, Verlin and the secret tongues of rebellion. As the echoes of medieval festivals fade into the mists of time, let us journey forward through the centuries to discover how the human impulse to invert language and meaning found a new expression in the streets and shadows of more recent ages. We find ourselves now in the labyrinthine neighborhoods of 19th century Paris, where young voices whisper in tones that sound like French but flow in reverse, where words themselves become weapons of resistance, and where the simple act of speaking backwards transforms from village curiosity into urban survival. The year is 1862, and the narrow streets of Belleville wind up the hillside like a maze of secrets. Here, in the working-class quarters where the new industrial age has gathered the poor like iron filings to a magnet, a different kind of backwards language is being born. Not the charming village inversion of Lavoux, but something harder, more necessary, forged in the furnace of urban struggle and the constant surveillance of authority. Picture, if you will, a young man named August, perhaps 17 years old, with the calloused hands of a factory worker and eyes that hold the particular wariness of those who have learned to navigate a world where power and poverty exist in constant tension. He stands in the doorway of a small cafe on the Rue de Belleville, watching the street through the grimy window as gaslight flickers against the December dusk. When he speaks to his companions, his words emerge in a fluid, musical inversion that transforms ordinary French into something that sounds like poetry written backwards. Regarde-moi ca, he says, but the words come out as garde-moi ca, the syllables flipped, rearranged, inverted in a pattern that makes perfect sense to his listeners, but would sound like gibberish to any passing gendarme. This is Verlin, a form of slang that takes its very name from the backwards pronunciation of l'envers, the reverse. It is the language of the margins, the tongue of those who must speak in code to survive. August and his friends are part of a generation that has inherited both the revolutionary spirit of their fathers and the harsh realities of an increasingly surveilled society. The Paris of Napoleon III is a city of grand boulevards and secret police, of industrial progress and persistent poverty. In this environment, language itself becomes a form of resistance, a way to create community in the face of authority, to maintain dignity in the midst of oppression. The cafe where Auguste gathers with his friends is typical of the establishments that dot the working-class neighborhoods of Paris. The zinc-topped bar reflects the warm glow of gas lamps, while the air is thick with the smoke of cheap tobacco and the steam from bowls of coffee mixed with chicory. Here, conversations flow in and out of Verlin like a river changing course, sometimes crystal clear, sometimes deliberately obscured, always carrying undercurrents of meaning that go deeper than the words themselves. The origins of Verlin stretch back through the underground culture of French society, finding its roots in the argot of criminals and the street slang of the dispossessed. But in the Paris of the 1860s, it is evolving into something more sophisticated, more systematic. The young workers who gather in places like Auguste's Café are not merely inverting words for the sake of concealment. They are creating a parallel language that allows them to express experiences and emotions that standard French cannot adequately capture. Listen as Auguste describes a confrontation with his factory foreman. Le mec, il nous a dit, reste là, mais nous, on s'est barré quand même. But in Verlin, the words transform. Le kiem, il nous a dit te rise là, mais nous, on s'est rebar quand même. The meaning remains the same. The guy told them to stay put, but they left anyway. But the language has been armored with inversion, made safe for public consumption, wrapped in a linguistic code that protects both speaker and listener. The process of creating Verlin is both systematic and intuitive. Single-syllable words are often simply reversed. Mec becomes kiem. Femme becomes moif. Multi-syllable words are broken apart and rearranged. Cigarette becomes garetsai. Police becomes lispo. But the true artistry lies in the way speakers adapt these transformations to the rhythm and flow of conversation, creating a language that sounds natural even as it inverts the very building blocks of meaning. In the workshops and factories of Belleville, Verlin serves multiple purposes. Workers use it to discuss their grievances without alerting supervisors, to share information about job opportunities or labor organizing, to create a sense of solidarity in the face of exploitation. The language becomes a badge of identity, a way of marking who belongs to the community of the dispossessed and who remains an outsider. But Verlin is more than just a practical tool for avoiding detection. It represents a profound form of linguistic creativity, a way of claiming ownership over language itself. In a society where the poor are expected to speak only when spoken to, where education is a privilege and eloquence a mark of class, the creation of Verlin represents a democratic revolution in language, a way for the marginalized to become poets of their own experience. The young women who work in the textile factories of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine have developed their own variations of Verlin, adapting it to their particular needs and circumstances. Marie-Louise, a seamstress who embroiders silk for the wealthy ladies of the 16th arrondissement, uses Verlin to discuss the absurdities of her work. Les meufs riches, elles veulent du beau drap sur leurs robes, or aller au theater. The rich women want beautiful work on their dresses to go to the theater, but the inverted language somehow captures the ridiculous contrast between the elegance of the finished product and the harsh conditions under which it is created. The children of these neighborhoods grow up bilingual in a way that would astonish their middle-class contemporaries. They speak standard French in school, Verlin in the streets, and develop an intuitive understanding of when to use each register. A 10-year-old boy might address his teacher in perfect, formal French, then turn to whisper to his friend in Verlin, so fluid and natural that it seems like a completely different language altogether. In the schools of working-class Paris, teachers wage a constant battle against the encroachment of Verlin into their classrooms. They view it as a corruption of proper French, a sign of moral and intellectual decay. But the children understand something their teachers do not, that Verlin is not a degradation of language, but an expansion of it, a way of creating multiple layers of meaning within a single conversation. The police and government authorities of the Second Empire are well aware of Verlin's existence, but they struggle to keep pace with its constant evolution. By the time they have learned to decode one set of inversions, the street has already moved on to new variations. The language changes like a living thing, adapting to new circumstances, incorporating new words, discarding old forms that have become too widely known. During the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune of 1871, Verlin takes on new political dimensions. The language of inversion becomes a tool of revolution, allowing communards to communicate plans and share information while evading the surveillance of government forces. In the barricaded streets of Belleville and Montmartre, Verlin helps bind together a community in resistance, creating linguistic bonds that are as strong as the physical barriers they erect against authority. August, now a man of 26, finds himself using Verlin to coordinate the distribution of food during the commune's siege. Les cuves arrivent, he might whisper to a companion. The police are coming, using the inverted word to warn of danger without alerting potential informers. The language that began as a way to avoid trouble has become a tool for making it, a weapon in the arsenal of those who would remake the world. But Verlin's power extends beyond its practical applications. It represents a fundamental reimagining of the relationship between language and authority. In a society where the ability to speak properly is a mark of social standing, the creation of a parallel language system represents a profound challenge to existing hierarchies. Verlin suggests that there is no single correct way to use language, that meaning can be created through inversion just as easily as through convention. The linguistic innovations of 19th century Paris would spread far beyond the boundaries of the city, carried by migrants and travelers to other urban centers throughout France and beyond. Each new community would adapt Verlin to its own needs and circumstances, creating regional variations that maintain the essential principle of inversion while reflecting local conditions and concerns. In the mining towns of northern France, Verlin would merge with the particular rhythms of industrial labor, creating a language that could be understood even over the noise of machinery. In the ports of Marseille, it would incorporate elements from the many languages that flowed through the Mediterranean trading networks, becoming a truly cosmopolitan form of linguistic inversion. The phenomenon was not limited to France. Throughout Europe, similar processes were creating inverted languages in the margins of society. In London, the costermongers developed a form of backslang that served functions similar to Verlin. In Naples, the young people of the working-class neighborhoods created their own systems of linguistic inversion. Each culture found its own way to turn language upside down, to create meaning through reversal, to build community through shared codes. As the 19th century drew to a close, Verlin had evolved from a simple form of criminal argot into a sophisticated linguistic system that could express the full range of human experience. It had become a literature of the streets, a poetry of resistance, a way of transforming the very act of speaking into a form of creative rebellion. The legacy of Verlin would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century, adapting to new circumstances and new technologies. In the housing projects of the 1960s and 70s, it would be reborn as a language of immigrant communities, a way for the children of North African immigrants to create their own identity within French society. In the hip-hop culture of the 1980s and 90s, it would find new expression in rap lyrics and street poetry. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Verlin is how it reveals the fundamental human capacity for linguistic creativity. In the face of oppression, surveillance, and social marginalization, people do not simply accept the language they are given. They transform it, invert it, make it their own. They prove that language is not a fixed system imposed from above, but a living, breathing creation that can be reshaped by anyone with the imagination and courage to speak the world differently. As Auguste grows old in the changing Paris of the Belle Epoque, he continues to speak in the inverted language of his youth, now enriched by decades of experience and adaptation. The words flow from his lips like music, carrying within them the memory of a time when speaking backwards was not just a curiosity, but a necessity. When the simple act of inverting language could be a form of resistance, a way of claiming dignity in the face of oppression. The language of shadows continues to evolve, continues to adapt, continues to prove that the human spirit cannot be contained by any system of authority, no matter how comprehensive or sophisticated. In the end, Verlaine teaches us that meaning is not something that can be controlled or monopolized, but something that emerges wherever people gather to speak their truth, even if they must speak it backwards to keep it safe. Verse 4. The bewildered bureaucrat, a world beyond understanding. Let us return now to the gentle hills of western France, to the village of Lavoux, where our journey began. But this time, we see it through very different eyes. The year is 1354, 7 years after we first met young Marie Claire, and the morning mist rises from the cobblestones like the breath of sleeping giants. But today, this backward-speaking village will encounter something it has rarely faced. The uncomprehending gaze of absolute authority, embodied in the person of one magistrate Henry de Montclair, tax collector extraordinary to His Majesty the King. Picture, if you will, a man in his middle years, dressed in the fine woolen robes that mark his station, astride a horse that seems almost too well fed for the hard times that have fallen upon the countryside. Magistrate de Montclair carries with him the weight of royal authority, a leather satchel full of official documents, and the absolute certainty that the world operates according to clear, logical principles that any reasonable person should be able to understand. He is about to discover just how fragile that certainty can be. The magistrate's mission is simple, at least in theory. The crown requires an accurate accounting of the village's population, livestock, and taxable goods. France is still recovering from the great mortality that swept through the land, and the royal treasury needs to understand exactly what resources remain in even the smallest communities. It is, he believes, a straightforward administrative task that should take no more than a morning to complete. As his horse's hooves echo against the stone bridge that marks the entrance to Lavoux, Magistrate de Montclair feels the familiar satisfaction of a job well begun. He has performed this duty in dozens of villages throughout the region, and while the peasants are often slow to understand his requirements, they are generally cooperative once the weight of royal authority is properly explained. He has no reason to suspect that Lavoux will be any different from the countless other small communities he has visited. The first sign that something is amiss comes when he encounters the village's welcoming committee. Old Pierre, the blacksmith, approaches with what appears to be a warm smile and raises his hand in what seems like a friendly greeting. Au revoir, Monsieur le Magistrat, he says with apparent warmth. We are so sorry to see you arrive. De Montclair's horse shifts restlessly beneath him as he processes these words. The greeting seems both welcoming and dismissive, both courteous and rude. Perhaps the old man is simply nervous in the presence of royal authority, or maybe his wits have been addled by age. The magistrate decides to respond with the dignity befitting his station. Good morning, my good man. I am here on the king's business to conduct a census of this village. How wonderful that you are leaving so soon, replies Pierre, his smile never wavering. We are delighted by your departure and hope you will stay away for a very long time. A small crowd begins to gather, drawn by the novelty of a stranger in their midst. Marie Claire, now a young woman of 21, emerges from her family's cottage with a basket of bread. She curtsies politely to the magistrate and says, Au revoir, monsieur. How terrible to meet you. I hope you are feeling perfectly awful this morning. The magistrate's certainty begins to develop its first hairline cracks. These people seem friendly enough, but their words make no sense whatsoever. Perhaps they are speaking some local dialect that he has not encountered before, or maybe they are attempting some form of rustic humor that escapes his educated understanding. He decides to press forward with his mission, confident that the authority of his position will eventually clarify matters. "I require to speak with your village elder," he announces in his most official tone. "The crown has need of information about your population and resources." The villagers exchange glances that seem to carry meaning he cannot decipher. An elderly woman, whom he takes to be the village's wise woman, steps forward. "We are so unhappy to help you," she says with what appears to be genuine enthusiasm. "Please, do not come to my house where you will not be welcome, and let us not give you anything you might need." Following this incomprehensible invitation, the magistrate finds himself being led through the village square by a procession of backwards walking residents who chatter amongst themselves in their impossible language. They seem to be discussing him, but their words float past his understanding like leaves on a river flowing in the wrong direction. The cottage of the village elder, a man named Émile Rousseau, sits at the center of Lavoux like a stone dropped in still water. As they approach, children run ahead, announcing their arrival with what sound like departing farewells. "Au revoir, Papa Rousseau. A visitor is leaving." They call, their voices bright with excitement. Émile emerges from his cottage, a man of perhaps 60 years whose weathered face speaks of decades spent reading the moods of weather and soil. He greets the magistrate with the same backwards courtesy that has been plaguing de Montclair since his arrival. "Au revoir, Monsieur le Magistrat. How sorry I am to see you come. Please do not enter my home where you will not be comfortable." The magistrate's head is beginning to ache. Every interaction seems to follow the same pattern. Apparent courtesy, expressed through what sound like expressions of dismissal or hostility. He begins to wonder if he has stumbled into some form of elaborate practical joke, or perhaps a village populated entirely by people whose minds have been affected by some local malady. Inside Emile's cottage, the confusion only deepens. The room is comfortable enough, with a fire crackling in the hearth, and the smell of baking bread drifting from the kitchen. But when Émile offers him food, he says, "Please, do not eat this bread, and refuse this wine that I hope you will not enjoy." When the magistrate accepts the offered refreshments, his host beams with pleasure while saying, "How terrible that you are taking sustenance in my home. I am so disappointed by your appetite." The magistrate attempts to explain his mission, but every question he asks seems to generate answers that make no sense. When he inquires about the village's population, Émile responds, "We have no people here at all, as you can clearly see by looking at all the residents walking around." When he asks about livestock, he is told, "We possess no animals whatsoever, except for all the cattle, sheep, and pigs that you can hear making noise in our barns." As the morning progresses, the magistrate's confusion transforms into something approaching panic. He has built his entire career on the foundation of clear communication and logical procedure. But in Lavoux, these tools seem utterly useless. Every answer he receives contradicts itself. Every statement seems to mean its opposite, and every attempt to clarify matters only makes them more opaque. The children of the village, sensing his bewilderment, begin to gather around him with the cruel fascination that the young often show for adult confusion. They offer to help him understand, but their explanations only make matters worse. "When we say goodbye, we mean hello," explains a boy of perhaps 10 years. "When we say no, we mean yes. When we say we are sad, we mean we are happy." It is very simple, but that makes no sense. The magistrate exclaims, his professional composure finally cracking. Words must mean what they mean. How can goodbye mean hello? How can no mean yes? Language cannot function if every word means its opposite. The children exchange glances and begin to giggle. One of them, a girl with bright eyes and a mischievous smile, pats his arm consolingly. "Poor monsieur," she says with what sounds like genuine sympathy. "You must be very confused because you think words can only mean one thing. But here in Lavoux, we know that words can mean whatever we want them to mean." The magistrate's attempts to conduct his census become increasingly desperate. He tries to count the houses, But the villagers insist on telling him how many houses they do not have, while pointing to the ones that clearly exist. He attempts to inventory the livestock, but the farmers describe in detail all the animals they definitely do not possess, while leading him to barns full of cattle, sheep, and pigs. When he asks about the village's grain stores, he is told, "We have no grain at all, which is why our barns are completely empty," by a miller whose clothing is dusted with flour and whose mill wheel turns steadily beside the stream. When he inquires about the local church, the priest himself appears to declare, "We have no church and no priest, and I certainly do not conduct services every Sunday for a congregation that does not exist." By midday, the magistrate's carefully organized documents have become a chaos of contradictory information. His neat columns of figures are filled with impossible data. A village with no inhabitants that clearly teems with life. Livestock that does not exist but can be seen and heard. Grain stores that are empty but obviously full. The logical framework that has always guided his work has collapsed entirely. The breaking point comes when he attempts to assess the village's tax obligations. Standing in the square, surrounded by the backward-speaking villagers, he raises his voice to address them all. "By the authority vested in me by His Majesty the King, I command you to speak plainly. I require clear answers to clear questions. Stop this linguistic madness." The villagers respond to his outburst with what appears to be genuine concern. They murmur among themselves in their inverted language, and then Marie Claire steps forward. "Monsieur le Magistrat," she says gently, "we are not trying to confuse you. We are speaking as plainly as we know how. This is simply how we talk in Lavoux. We mean no disrespect to you or to the king." For the first time, the magistrate hears sincerity in her voice that transcends the backwards words. He looks around at the faces surrounding him and sees not mockery or rebellion, but genuine puzzlement at his distress. These people are not trying to deceive him. They are simply being themselves, speaking their natural language, living their lives according to customs that make perfect sense to them, even if they are incomprehensible to outsiders. The realization is both humbling and terrifying. In all his years of service, the magistrate has never encountered a community that could not be understood through the application of proper procedure and royal authority. But Lavoux exists in a world where his most basic assumptions about communication and meaning simply do not apply. He is like a man trying to use a key that fits no lock, speaking a language that shares no common ground with the one he hears around him. As the afternoon sun begins to cast long shadows across the village square, Magistrate de Montclair makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his career. He closes his ledger, gathers his papers, and announces that he cannot complete his mission. The village of Lavoux, he will report to his superiors, is somehow beyond the reach of normal administrative procedures. The villagers receive this news with expressions of what seem like disappointment, but which he now understands might actually be relief. They bid him farewell with their backwards goodbyes, walking him to the edge of the village while expressing their sorrow at his departure and their hope that he will return very soon. As his horse carries him away from Lavoux, the magistrate turns back to look one last time at the village that has defeated him. The houses look perfectly ordinary, the people seem pleasant enough, and the smoke rising from the chimneys speaks of normal domestic life. Yet he knows that behind that facade of normalcy lies a world that operates according to principles he cannot fathom, a place where meaning itself has been turned upside down. The magistrate's report to his superiors will be a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion. He will struggle to explain how a village can exist while somehow remaining beyond the reach of royal authority, how people can speak French while being completely incomprehensible, how a community can be both cooperative and impossible to work with. His superiors will assume that he has simply encountered a particularly stubborn or backward rural community, and they will send other officials to complete the census. But those officials will face the same bewilderment, the same gentle defeat at the hands of a people who have learned to live in a world where up is down where goodbye means hello, and where the very act of speaking has become a form of protection against the incomprehending gaze of authority. Years later, when Magistrate de Montclair has retired from royal service and spends his evenings by the fire in his comfortable house, he will sometimes remember the village of Lavoux. He will recall the feeling of being completely lost in a place where everyone else seemed perfectly at home, of speaking a language that no one else could understand, of discovering that the world is far stranger and more mysterious than any bureaucratic manual could ever anticipate. And sometimes, in his dreams, he will hear the backwards voices of Lavoux bidding him farewell as he arrives, welcoming him with their goodbye, expressing their sorrow at his coming and their joy at his departure. In those dreams, he will finally understand that he was not the victim of a practical joke or a linguistic anomaly, but a witness to the profound human capacity to create meaning in the face of authority, to build community through shared incomprehension, and to find dignity in the simple act of speaking the world differently. The village of Lavoux will continue to exist in its backwards way, speaking its inverted language, living its upside-down life, proving that there are always communities at the margins of the official world, places where different rules apply, where meaning flows in unexpected directions, and where the very act of being incomprehensible becomes a form of freedom. Conclusion: the endless dance of inversion. And so we come to the end of our journey through the upside-down world of human communities, though like all the best endings, this one is really a beginning in disguise. We have walked backwards through the streets of Lavoux, danced in the inverted hierarchies of medieval festivals, whispered in the coded language of urban resistance, and stood bewildered alongside a magistrate whose certainty crumbled in the face of a world that refused to make sense in the expected ways. As you lie there in the gentle darkness, perhaps feeling the weight of sleep beginning to settle over your thoughts like a soft blanket, consider the remarkable consistency of the human impulse to turn the world upside down. From the backward-speaking villages of rural France to the sacred chaos of the Festival of Misrule, from the secret languages of Parisian streets to the bureaucratic bewilderment of official authority, we find the same pattern repeating across centuries and cultures. The need to create spaces where different rules apply, where meaning flows in unexpected directions, where the very act of inversion becomes a form of freedom. These communities of inversion teach us something profound about the nature of human creativity and resistance. They show us that people have always found ways to speak their truth, even when that truth must be spoken backwards to be heard. They reveal that the most powerful forms of rebellion are often the gentlest ones, requiring no violence, no grand gestures, only the quiet courage to see the world from a different angle. In the village of Lavoux, where goodbye means hello and sadness expresses joy, we discovered that language itself can become a form of protection, a way of creating community among those who understand while remaining incomprehensible to those who would impose their will from outside. The children who learned to walk backwards before they could walk forwards were not simply learning a quirky local custom. They were inheriting a way of being that valued difference over conformity, mystery over clarity, playfulness over rigid adherence to convention. The Festival of Misrule showed us that even the most hierarchical societies recognize the need for temporary inversions, for brief moments when the world could be turned upside down and everyone could glimpse alternative arrangements of power and meaning. The boy bishop who blessed his congregation with holy water that sparkled like stars was not just playing a game. He was participating in a profound ritual of renewal that reminded everyone that the world is not as fixed and immutable as it might seem. In the streets of 19th century Paris, where young workers spoke in Berlin to avoid the surveillance of authority, we saw how inversion could become a tool of survival and solidarity. The words that flowed backwards from their lips carried more than meaning. They carried the dignity of those who refused to be silenced, the creativity of those who would not accept the language they were given, but insisted on making it their own. And in the bewilderment of Magistrate de Montclair, We witness the moment when official authority encounters something it cannot comprehend or control. His defeat was not a victory of chaos over order, but a recognition that the world is far more complex and mysterious than any system of power can fully encompass. There will always be villages like Lavoux, communities that exist in the margins of the official world, speaking their own languages, following their own customs, proving that human diversity cannot be contained within any single framework of understanding. These stories remind us that the capacity for inversion is not just a historical curiosity, but a living part of the human spirit. Even now, in our own time, there are communities that choose to speak differently, to organize themselves according to alternative principles, to find freedom in the spaces between official categories. The impulse that created the backward speech of Lavoux continues to manifest in new forms, adapted to new circumstances, but driven by the same fundamental need to create meaning through difference. Perhaps most importantly, these upside-down communities teach us about the nature of meaning itself. They show us that meaning is not something fixed and eternal, handed down from above by authorities who claim to know better, but something that emerges from the interactions between people who choose to understand each other. In Lavoux, goodbye meant hello because everyone agreed that it did. In the Festival of Misrule, peasants could wear crowns because the community chose to recognize their temporary authority. In the streets of Paris, Verlaine carried meaning because young people invested it with their experiences and emotions. This is perhaps the most subversive lesson of all, that meaning is not discovered but created, not inherited but chosen, not imposed but negotiated through the complex dance of human interaction. The backward-speaking villagers of Lavoux were not confused or mistaken. They were exercising the fundamental human right to create their own reality through language, to build their own world through the simple act of speaking it into existence. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you the gentle wisdom of these inverted communities. Remember that the world is not as solid and unchangeable as it might appear, that there are always alternative ways of seeing and being, that the most profound truths often come disguised as their opposites. The villagers of Lavoux, who said goodbye when they meant hello, were not being perverse. They were being human in the deepest sense, using the gift of language to create connection rather than simply to transmit information. In the end, all of these stories of inversion return us to the same fundamental insight, that the human capacity for meaning-making is infinite, that creativity and resistance are the same impulse expressed in different ways, and that the most powerful form of freedom is the freedom to imagine the world differently. The backward-speaking villages, the upside-down festivals, the secret languages, and the bewildered bureaucrats all remind us that reality is far more flexible than we usually assume, that with enough imagination and courage, any community can choose to turn its world upside down and discover what it looks like from the other side. So sleep well, gentle travelers, and perhaps in your dreams you will visit a village where the words flow backwards like a river running uphill, where the children walk in reverse and the seasons celebrate their own endings. Perhaps you will dance at a festival where peasants wear crowns and time itself runs backwards, where the last become first and the first become last in a great celebration of human possibility. Perhaps you will hear whispered in the shadows a language that speaks truth through inversion, that creates beauty through resistance, that finds freedom in the spaces between the words. And when you wake, you might find that the world looks slightly different than it did before, that the familiar has become strange and the strange has become familiar, that the simple act of turning things upside down has revealed possibilities you never knew existed. For this is the gift of the backward-speaking communities. They show us that the world we think we know is only one of many possible worlds, and that with enough courage and creativity, we can always choose to speak our truth, even if we must speak it backwards to be heard. Au revoir, dear listeners. Hello and goodbye, and welcome to the endless dance of inversion that makes us human.